Good evening. I'm Scott Mink from the Department of Political Science and the Bucknell Institute for Public Policy. Thank you all for attending, and I want to give a special thanks to all of the departments and programs who are sponsoring tonight's event. It's a long list. It includes the Bucknell Institute for Public Policy, the Bucknell Center for Sustainability and the Environment, the Departments of Economics, Political Science, Sociology and Anthropology, and Civil and Environmental Engineering, along with the Grand Challenge Scholars Program and the School of Management's Managing for Sustainability program. Our speaker tonight is Bucknell graduate Alexandra Campbell Ferrari, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Water Security and Cooperation and an adjunct professor in law at the George Washington University Law School. Alexandra earned her law degree at GW and then practiced with Sullivan & Worcester LLP in its environmental, energy, and natural resources practice, where she co-authored an amicus curiae brief to the U.S. Supreme Court on stormwater issues. In addition to her other work with the government and with the private sector, Alexandra spent a year in Madrid as a Fulbright scholar, researching European and Spanish water law and watershed management. Building on these experiences and on her expertise, Alexandra co-founded the Center for Water Security and Cooperation, which is working to strengthen the legal framework for water protection, management, and governance. We're very pleased to have Alexandra back with us at Bucknell tonight to speak on the topic Water Challenges, Achieving Water Security in a Time of Water Scarcity. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I want to thank specifically Professor Greg Crone for inviting me, first of all, to teach a class. I taught a very law-intensive class this afternoon on riparianism and prior appropriation to allocation doctrines in the legal system, which I promise I will not bore you with. So no fear, this is not what this is about today. So thank you to Professor Crone for having me here. It's an honor to be back. So as Professor Mink said, I graduated in 2009, and I'm just going to start, I'll talk a little bit about myself and why I started the organization and why I got to thinking about water issues and why these issues mean so much to me and they should mean as much to you. So when I went to law school, I started law school right after Bucknell, and if anybody had asked me, I never ever would have said that I was going to be an environmental lawyer. I didn't take any environmental law classes here. I didn't take any environmentally focused classes here. I actually went to law school to become an international lawyer. And I took an internship after my first year of law school with the Connecticut Attorney General's office in their environmental bureau. And I worked with the attorneys there on environmental matters, one of which really started me thinking about the way in which we think about the environment and what our role is in protecting it. So there was a private citizen who had a property in the Norwalk Sound in Connecticut, and he had decided he wanted to build a little bank outside and outside of his property in the water. And what that meant was getting rid of a significant portion of the wetlands there. Well, if you know anything about wetlands, they are particularly important to water. They serve as a filter. They serve as a home for different fish and species like that. And even when he consulted the government and they said, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to fill this in and then build what you want, he did it anyways. And I'm not quite sure, it was maybe a half an acre or a third of an acre of wetlands that were lost, but I thought to myself, why is this the case? Why are people thinking about these issues? Why did he feel like he could do that? And so I saw the potential in environmental law. And so after that, I practiced at Sullivan, and I wanted to get an international perspective, so I went to Spain. And I looked at the European system, and I looked at all that they're doing, and I said, wow, the United States has so far to go, and there's so much we can learn, and we're really not talking about these issues. You know, if you look at the United States in the news, you've recently seen issues like Flint. I hope many of you have been watching Flint, and maybe the California drought as well. And that's it. There aren't really a lot of issues being discussed with respect to how we're going to change and how we're going to make sure that we have water available in 25 or 50 years. And in large part, when I started practicing law, I started realizing that we don't even have a framework for talking about these issues. And what is at stake is so great here that they can't not be talked about. So tonight, I will be discussing achieving water security in a time of water scarcity. So Benjamin Franklin, in all of his wisdom, said, when the well is dry, we know the worth of water. I actually challenge that. I don't think we do. We have the drought in California, and it hasn't changed our way of thinking. We had Flint right after it. We're still not talking about these issues in the way that we need to be. And droughts and contaminated water is not sparking that conversation like we need. So instead, we turn to crazy ideas like mining an asteroid, literally taking the water from an asteroid outside of Earth and bringing it back here. Now, in large part, what they're really doing is trying to take that water and use it for fuel creation, but there are people talking about the ability to bring that water back to planet Earth in case if we run out of drinking water here. That's crazy. And this is actually a headline from one of a news story several years ago. Desalination. So this is something more realistic. A lot of us have heard about desalination, but if you think about these issues, it takes a considerable amount of energy to run a desal plant. And ironically enough, it takes a lot of water to run and energy to generate electricity. So here's a fact it takes 3,460 kilowatts per acre foot to pump water from North Carolina to San Diego. So that's a water transfer from Northern California down into the south. Carlsbad, which is one of the recently constructed desal plants, will use about 30% more energy, which is 5,000 kilowatts per acre foot, to desalinate ocean water and deliver it to households. So we'd rather turn to this than figure out how we can better protect our own water resources. Not to mention the fact that all these desal plants create another waste that we have to figure out how to deal with, and that's salt. So generally we think of salt as fairly good, we put it on our food, but in this instance it's terrible. And we produce a ton of it through desal, and we have to find a way and a place to put it. And oftentimes that means shipping it way out into the ocean and then plunging it way down, but still there are significant consequences to the ecosystem when you do this. So we drill deeper wells. We transfer water longer distances. We're even talking about bringing an iceberg closer. I mean, that's crazy. And this article here on the California legislature endorses plan to tow iceberg from Antarctica was from the 1970s, which I actually think is really funny because at that point we apparently had to have the technology to do that, but there were imaging of this and real discussion through the newspapers of this. But these are other get your iceberg water here. Serious discussions about bringing an iceberg down into Africa to deal with their water crisis. And the last is a mechanism to create water from atmosphere, so air. So essentially, and there's an apparatus that sucks in the air, cools it, and creates water. So we're almost willing to do anything but actually face the issues before us. And there's so much that we could do. We can conserve use, we can become more energy efficient, more water efficient, and we can actually reduce our use. So reduce the amount of water that we use. So before I talk about what we can do, I think it's important, in large part, to talk about what's at stake. Because when we talk about water issues, we aren't just talking about water issues. It's not just the water that we drink, it's not just the water that we see in the stream, so that's a huge part of it. But these are 6 things that are at stake if we don't start thinking about these issues differently. So one is our actual drinking water and sanitation, our energy supply, our food supply, recreation, manufacturing and industry, navigation and trade. These are all issues, all things that depend on water, whether or not you know it or not. So where is Earth's water? I mean, if you look at planet Earth, you see these beautiful images of Earth is blue and green, and most of the Earth is actually blue. So a lot of people ask, okay, well, why, how do we have a water issue? How can there possibly be a water issue when most of our planet is blue? Well, the problem is that almost 97% of Earth is oceans. So then the result is we have to desal to be able to use it. And that's for drinking water, and for most part, that's for any kind of industrial process. You have to have fresh water, clean water that's without salt. So that leads us to about 2.5% of water that's fresh water. Of that 2.5%, about 69% of it is stuck in glaciers and ice caps, which I said we were also considering towing, so I guess that's a real possibility. 30% of it is in groundwater, and then 1.2% of it is in surface water. It's kind of hard to believe that that's how much water is in surface waters. From all the amount of water that we have on Earth, 1.2% of it is fresh water. So then you can break that down even more into lakes, atmosphere, swamps and marshes, in the soil moisture, in rivers, and in living things, so creatures themselves, and in ground ice and permafrost. So here's some images that demonstrate where our actual withdrawal and our actual consumption. So there is a difference between the two. We withdraw water to use it, and it can be used and then put back into a river. So that's for thermoelectric, for instance. You draw in a lot of water to cool some of the mechanisms, and then you spit it back out into the ocean or the river, and it's not a consumed use. On the other side, we have US freshwater consumption. And what is so striking here is that almost 80% of it is used for irrigation. And when we talk about irrigation, it's primarily either fabrics for clothing or food. It's primarily food, which is the other thing that we depend on. So we depend on water itself, but we also depend on food. And almost 85% of our water is going towards irrigation. So again, just pulling out how important these issues are. So to touch on each of these. So drinking water and sanitation. It's a tired phrase to say that our life depends on water. I mean, we all say it, we all know it. But we continue to fail to really appreciate the magnitude of the issues and the magnitude and the ways in which water touches upon our life. Drinking water and sanitation is one of the most basic. In the US, everybody can walk into their home, they flip open the tap, and they get this safe, clean, fresh drinking water. In some areas, it tastes better than others. I know for DC, it tastes pretty bad, but it's safe. That's pretty amazing. That's unheard of. It's not the norm necessarily. But then we had Flint, and Flint exposed some of those issues that we're facing, where it exposed our lack of financing and investing in our infrastructure, in our water infrastructure, and prioritization of transport systems, of roads, over water infrastructure. In large part because most people don't even know how they get their drinking water and wastewater. And to be honest, I can't say that I did in college either. It wasn't until I started working on these issues that I really did understand what brought my water to where and how it was treated and what the standards were. So we look at Flint, and we look at the devastation that's happening there. The fact that so many children have been exposed to lead, the fact that there are significant consequences that we don't even know about, that we're going to find out about in the years to come. And then not long after that, we find out that possibly there are schools in Newark, actually there are schools in Newark, that have lead-contaminated water in them. And in large part, that's because of a loophole in the law that puts these restrictions on public water systems, but don't require schools to test their water. That's disappointing. It's disappointing, and as a lawyer, that's exactly what we look at. And that's what I do through the center. Recently, the UN issued its Sustainable Development Goals. And for the first time, it had initially, back in the 1990s, issued their Millennium Development Goals, and now they have their Sustainable Development Goals. And one of those priorities is finally drinking water and sanitation. They finally make that a priority to say this is fundamental to the development of your people and your country. And that's a huge advancement for us, and that's something that we have to take to heart. That's what the international community is now responsible for achieving, is access to drinking water and access to sanitation. Now, fortunately, in the United States, that's pretty common, but there are other countries in which that's not. In fact, there are averages in countries like in Africa. Several of the countries in Africa have averages where women and young girls spend, on average, 5 to 6 hours a day walking water to and from their community instead of being educated. So the consequence of not having access to water is significant. It means that you're not developing a group of educated women who will be able to take leadership positions and be role models for people in the community. That's a pretty devastating, I think, number. 5 hours a day. Can you imagine spending 5 hours a day walking water to and from? So I thought this was interesting just to bring home certain points here. This is a graph or a map of how much people pay on average for their municipal water. So they have water, so their municipal water, their sewer, and their stormwater. And this is a monthly bill for a family of 4. So on average, many people are paying $50 a month for water, and they're paying $100, $200, or more for their cable bills and their telephones. So we're willing to pay more for telephones and cell phone service. We're willing to pay more for our televisions and our cable access, but we're not as willing to pay for water. Energy. Almost 90% of the electrical generating capacity of the US is produced by thermoelectric power plants. And all of those plants depend on water. So essentially what happens is that water is used to generate the steam that powers the turbines, that generate the electricity, and then to cool the equipment after it generates that power. It's not consumed, so when it's used, about 96% of it's actually returned to the water course, but still, you have to actually have the water available in order to be able to use it. So while it doesn't disappear after that use, you still have to have it in order to operate those plants. So think about all the things that depend on electricity nowadays. Your phones, our satellites, our basic lighting structures. I mean, it's amazing how much depends on electricity and how much we depend on it. And there have been water shortages that have actually threatened to take power plants offline. And this is in the United States. This isn't just in developing countries, where we oftentimes think that these issues are isolated. We're as vulnerable in the United States to these issues as any other country. And at the same time, there's this big push to switch to renewables, which emit fewer greenhouse gases, and that's great. But they too require and depend on water. So hydropower, for instance, it requires water in order to generate that electricity. So when we're thinking about our energy policies and our energy plans, we have to be thinking about water. And if you look at COP21, the recent climate change summit in Paris, the issue of water was in one meeting, and it generated one agreement outside of the general realm of their conversation. That's not enough. It's not enough to bring these issues to the forefront. One of the other things is that our renewable energy policy here in the United States has suggested and required the turn to ethanol. Well, ethanol comes from corn. We have to have water to irrigate the corn. And then not to mention the fact of all the water costs in taking that corn and making it into an ethanol product. So our policies, our energy policies, are almost suggesting very water-intensive processes without thinking about the water consequences and only looking to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Well-intentioned, but not the right approach. And some of these are just the pictures of a hydroelectric dam, if you're interested, or just generally the electric plant here and how it operates. So you can see where the water comes out at the end and that it's not a consumptive use. Food. So these are a number of headlines from recent news articles talking about food and the likelihood of food shortages in the event of climate change. And climate change and water reduction, we see General Mills is warning that climate change will lead to global food shortages. Haiti, the drought worsens the food crisis. And you look at the malnutrition, and again, people are suffering from, it's not climate change, it's the fact that we don't have enough water. Kind of telling. Food prices are surging. So one of the initial points of the conversation in California was that food prices were going to soar because all the farmers had to cut their uses. Now, in large part, there were certain things that the prices changed, like nuts, very water-intensive crops that didn't have that water available to them, and so the food price, so their prices did soar. But this could happen more extensively if this drought is felt everywhere. So recreation. This was off a beach in Mallorca in Spain that I went to. Absolutely, I mean, it's gorgeous. I mean, this is something that we all love. I mean, think about the memories that we have. So many memories of visiting a river, water skiing, boating, just swimming, fishing, the stories that we tell, the stories and the opportunities we have as children, sporting. I mean, the USA has a sailing team. Golf. I mean, I love golf, but it's tough to like it when they use so much water. And it's tough to like it when the effects and their interest in actually reducing that and thinking about putting in place different grass that will not require as much water, but still allow the game to be played. They're just not interested in that. They're not interested in having that conversation because we're so used to a very lush, beautiful golf course in the way that we created it. So some of the other sectors that are hit are manufacturing and industry. So your clothes, cotton. Cotton has to be grown. And again, irrigation comes from water. And then all the processing to make clothing requires water. Navigation and trade. You know, I happen to be looking at the history, I live in Washington, D.C., and I happen to be looking at the history of the Potomac River and the Anacostia River, and looking at the socioeconomic issues in D.C. And if you look back into the early 1700s, the Anacostia River was a major source of trade. It was a very navigable body. Huge ships could come up and down it and bring goods, and the Anacostia region was very wealthy. But through sedimentation, through the building of factories that polluted it, the water became polluted, the sedimentation, so essentially the sediment from the banks rolls into the river and it loses its depth. So those large boats that were able to make it up before couldn't. So trade suffered. And then the socioeconomic issue came in because people weren't trading there anymore. And that can have a huge effect on a community. So a once very wealthy, very vibrant society is now struggling socioeconomically because of that. Professor mentioned that I co-authored an amicus brief to the Supreme Court on stormwater issues. And our client was actually Douglas Emmett, who is a property developer in California. And I was so confused as to why a property developer would have any kind of interest in stormwater issues. But what I found is that they build properties on water. And when you have stormwater issues, you have flooding issues that come into effect. Water smells bad if it's of bad quality. So guess what? Who wants to buy a property on a river that smells horrific? No one wants to smell that. That's not a nice property to live in. Not to mention the fact that if you build vacation homes or you have some kind of travel industry, that you're also affected. The whole travel industry is affected. Because when rivers and lakes are polluted, or an ocean is polluted, or there is a sign out that says no swimming today due to possible stormwater releases. And there's signs throughout DC that say that in the event of a massive storm event, please do not touch the water. It's kind of scary, but I mean, at least they tell you before you do. That's crazy. And there's a huge, huge impact on these industries that depend on trade or depend on travel and depend on the tourism industry. And so Douglas Emmett had a major investment in having Los Angeles County actually make sure that stormwater was being treated the way it needed to be treated. It wasn't just running off into the river without being treated. Now, if you look at the manufacturing industry, I wanted to talk about bottled water. I mean, so many people depend on bottled water, and it's one of the worst things that you possibly could do. Because bottled water, honestly, comes from a tap somewhere. And there were recent court cases that discovered that Dasani and some of these other companies were using tap water, but not saying it. They were saying it was special water, and they were using very unique advertising to suck you in to think that you're drinking fantastic, amazing water from a special spring somewhere. But the amount of energy and the amount of water that's used even to create the plastic bottle, and then the water that's taken from the tap, it's not special. And if you depended more on your drinking water facilities, there'd be a greater value for them. So that's one of the biggest issues in the bottled water industry, is that it creates a lot of jobs. There's a huge dependence on it now. But by the same token, it's causing our infrastructure to suffer because more people are drinking bottled water than they are drinking tap water. And I mean, who can blame you, right? I mean, Flint is exactly the issue. I mean, how can you possibly trust your infrastructure if you could happen to have a Flint? And that's what's so scary, is that it's hard to advocate to people, go drink your tap water. When I look at Flint, I'm like, I find I can't say that because I don't want you to be unprotected. I mean, I recently had to have a plumber come to my house, and the first question I asked was, please tell me I don't have any lead pipes. The guy looked at me as if I was nuts, but he confirmed we don't, and I was very pleased to hear that. But that's a real issue, and that's what we should be thinking about, is that, we should support our municipal water, but we should be thinking about the effects that our consumerism has. And cars and tires, I always think that that's interesting, that the water it takes to make cars and tires is extensive. So respect your cars. So this is a complex landscape. It's really difficult to understand where to start from here. And in large part, this is where I sat and what we faced, my colleague and I faced, when we were trying to think of ways to tackle this issue. I came back from Spain and I said, we've got to do something. There's got to be a change in what we do. But how can we balance these issues? I mean, how can we go from something as broad of a concept as water security to these little discrete management plans down in river basins like the Susquehanna River. Now, that's not a small river basin, but smaller ones than that, specific lakes. That's a lot of things to think about, not to mention the fact that I'm trying to think about energy issues, think about food, think about recreation, think about navigation. That's a lot to manage. So how do we do that? And what do we actually need to do? So first and foremost, we have to have better data. It is so important that we have better data. We have to know what resources we have. We have to actually know how many liters of surface water that we have, how many liters of groundwater we have. And we don't. Surprisingly, we actually have very little idea as to how many liters, gallons of groundwater we have. And so what happens is that people take it and they take too much, and then that source is depleted and it can't regenerate because it's been depleted to a point that it can't be regenerated. But we've got to know how much water that we're working with, and we have to have better monitoring. We have to know what people are doing. We have to know how much water people are using, where it's going, if they're meeting their water quality standards. So something in Spain that I learned when I was down in the south in an autonomous region called Murcia is that different farmers, different regions of farmers got the right to use water. So 5 or 6 farmers would be in a little community, and they would have the permit. They, as a group of them, would hold the permit to a specific quantity of water. And so I asked them, part of the Water Framework Directive says you have to be incentivizing efficient water use. And I said, okay, that's great. That's a fantastic objective. So how are you doing that with farmers? And they're like, well, we give these 5 farmers this allocation, and we actually don't know how much each of them uses. And I was like, well, how are you incentivizing water efficiency? Well, the 5 of them have to meet that allocation. Okay, well, how are you incentivizing them to reduce their use? How are you incentivizing them to put in better mechanisms? Well, we've given them their allocation, and that's how much water they have to use, and they can figure it out amongst themselves. And so that's one of the beauties of monitoring, that if you had, for each farmer, a way to monitor how much water they could use, it could be essentially like a game between them, an incentive for them to reduce their use. And it's not that it can't be done. Now, it costs money, but there's a lot of government programs that will step in and help you with that. But we have to know how much water is being used, and we have to have ways of actually holding you accountable to the quantity of water that you're using. And some of this comes into play with businesses. I mean, think about businesses. Businesses are just starting to report their greenhouse gas emissions. They are still not reporting how much water they use. I mean, one of the most powerful mechanisms we could have is if the consumer saw how much water it took to make your shirt or your jacket or any of the products that you use. Because it would start you thinking of, wow, why did it take 3,000 gallons of water to produce this shirt? Because you can understand the magnitude of that. I mean, that's a lot of water. And that's not that far off of an estimate in terms of how much it takes to make these products. So holding businesses accountable and having ways to monitor their use, but using the consumer as a way to generate that accountability. The second is we need better infrastructure. There's just no question. Flint laid bare the issue that we need better infrastructure. And it costs a lot of money. I mean, they're talking about just the cost alone in Flint, and this is a tiny city up in Michigan. I mean, hundreds of thousands of dollars are going to have to be spent in order to remove the lead pipes and then improve their wastewater, their drinking water facility to treat the water coming out of the Flint River. So better infrastructure. We have leaking pipes. I mean, the amount of water that leaks out of a pipe that's bringing the water from the drinking water facility to your home is astounding. I mean, it depends on the system, but sometimes 40% of that can be lost. Now, it's not lost forever. It percolates into the soil, and it does provide other benefits in terms, if you have to think of a benefit that it provides. But there's so much energy that goes into bringing that water up into the system and then transferring it to the homes. It's such a waste of energy. And then, like we got back into before, it takes water to produce energy. There's a lot of waste that's being generated by wastewater treatment plants. Another opportunity to think about waste as a resource, to change the dialogue about the way in which we think about the environment and the waste we produce, and how to not produce that waste, or how to take that waste and create something valuable out of it. So at wastewater treatment plants, there's a ton of organic matter, and there's a ton of opportunities to add anaerobic digesters, capture that methane, build that section of an infrastructure of your wastewater treatment plant, and generate electricity. I mean, there's some wastewater treatment plants that have actually been taken off the grid because they generate their own electricity. I mean, that's astounding. Organic waste, what we send down the toilet. I mean, that's important. That's not a waste. That's a resource that can be used. And it takes creativity to think of these. But in Spain, this was one of the things that I really saw, this effort, especially in the south, to recycle water, to reuse water, to generate this energy. I mean, a real movement because water is so scarce there, and they've had these issues for centuries. One of the things that our organization focuses on is cooperation. We need better cooperation. We have to work together. You know, one of the things that I was talking about at the dinner before this is that, you know, what was amazing to me is that when I was in Spain, oftentimes the people talking to me about what the laws were engineers. It was phenomenal. I mean, I was so impressed with that. In the United States, it's often not the case. Lawyers and engineers are not often in the same room. Scientists and engineers and lawyers are not often in the same room. It's lawyers go off and write the laws, and you know, they hope, or our legislatures write the laws, and we hope that they achieve what they're intended to. And the engineers have done their studies that we rely on, but there's very little communication between the two. And it's going to take cooperation to build better laws. It's also going to have to take a sense of knowing that we're all in this together. So right now we have an interstate water conflict in the Apalachicola-Chattahoochee-Flint River. And back in the 1980s, they actually had an interstate water compact. So it's a legal agreement between these states that says, here's how much water we're going to use, here's how much water you're going to use, and this is, you know, this is how much, it's essentially allocation. Well, that expired, and they've been unable to create any kind of water allocation system after that, and they're in court now. So they're spending a special master who is definitely not a water expert. I mean, definitely, and you know, don't get me wrong, a very intelligent person. These judges and special masters are very intelligent, but they're not water experts. And these issues should be dealt with in the agencies, and the agencies that have the expertise to deal with these issues. And it should be done proactively rather than reactively. So now there is a water scarcity in that region. You have interests down in Florida who are trying to protect their oysters. You have Atlanta, which is growing by leaps and bounds and needs more drinking water. Now the two interests are not incompatible, but it's certainly going to take cooperation between these two states to make sure that those shared river basins are fairly and equitably allocated. You know, you look at, like I said, the role of industry. I mean, businesses use water. And they are so much a part of this conversation, and in large part they've been ostracized until recently. I mean, they're new members of the conversation, but they have so much effect on our water use and what we can do. We have Ethiopia and Egypt. There's a dam that Ethiopia has built, and the Egyptians are scared that they're, I mean, with being the upstream person, they're scared that they're not going to get any water from Ethiopia. And one of the biggest things that we have to do is actually take the politics out of water. This isn't a political issue. It's not about being a Republican or a Democrat. In fact, it was Nixon who started the EPA. It was under Nixon, President Nixon, that the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act were written. I mean, it's amazing. This is not a political issue. It's not about your political party. It's about the fact that we need drinking water, and we need water in order to survive. And the last part is that we need smarter laws. And that's where we come in. That's where my colleague and I at the center come in. We need a vision for water. We need a new way to think about water. And water security is one of those ways. Thinking about water and the ability to safeguard the availability of water for current and future generations and be able to adapt to the climatic changes that are happening. Whether or not you agree or disagree that climate change is real, we are certainly having more droughts and floods. And that we can agree on because we're seeing it. Hurricane Sandy is one example. New Orleans is another example. Cities are being destroyed by floods. And we have a way we can deal with that, better infrastructure. Droughts. We're dealing with a drought in California. We need better laws. We need to have conversations about what crops should be grown where. We need to have better water rights systems. I mean, this is what we spent the class talking about. And if you look at the discussions and the law that's in place, it's very weak. It requires an impractical balancing of interests, which really depends on the judge that's looking at the case. We have to recognize that there's a human right to water. You know, we don't like this term human right, but it just exists. we have to recognize there's that human right. We all depend on water. I mean, one of the most telling facts is that you can live without food for 30 days, but you can only live without water for about 3 days. That's crazy. I mean, that's how important water is to us, and that's why water has to be a human right. The example that I brought up earlier with the fact that there are young girls and women walking 5 to 6 hours a day to bring water to their community. Governments have to bring that water to them so they can have the same life that we have, the same opportunities presented to them that we have. We need better interstate water compacts. We need better understanding and better cooperation between parties. And interstate water compacts, like I said, in the ACF basin. Better agreements. I mean, there's no law requiring these states who share transboundary resources to enter into these agreements. No requirement right now that that's the case. Congress can issue one for them, but there's no requirement that states take it upon themselves to proactively allocate the water in these basins. And so what happens is that there's a crisis, and we react to the crisis instead of proactively thinking about the issues. One of the last things is we need better water tariffs. We have to think about the economic issues here. You know, in the Water Framework Directive in Europe, you have to get back what you've paid in water services. And this is a really tough balance to strike, because you want to make sure that everybody has access to water, but you also need people paying for their water. You have to place a value on water in terms of requiring people to invest in that system. I mean, if we're willing to pay $70, $80 to Verizon for our cell phones, we should be willing to pay $30 to $40 for our water bill. And in the event that you can't pay that, there should be systems in place to help you. But one of the biggest things that we have to do is really prioritize water. We have to make this an issue that we care about, and we have to make sure that it's an issue that we're talking about. And I actually found this in one of the pieces that I was writing. I was happening to look through some of the archives in EPA. And this is a statement by an EPA Assistant Administrator for Water and Hazardous Resources back in 1975. This was a year after the Safe Drinking Water Act went into effect. He said, through public notification requirement, the consumer becomes an enforcer and can exert pressure on the utility, the local government, and the state, demanding water that complies with the federal and state regulations. The Safe Drinking Water Act has real teeth from the federal level down to each of us as consumers. Now, while I would question whether or not the law has real teeth, I certainly believe in the fact that us as consumers have that power, and that each of us can make a difference. Each of us can be thinking about these issues and driving the conversation in whatever profession that you take on. And that is why it's so important to think about this and to know that as a consumer, you have power in this conversation. Thank you. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Hi, yes.
Hi, I'm actually Canadian, and one thing that we've always been a little afraid of is American bulk water import slash purchase. And I noticed that it wasn't one of your, sort of one of the main strategies that you put up there. I'm just wondering where it falls right now in the political landscape.
So bulk water import, do you have an example of?
Either diversion from freshwater rivers or frankly just sort of siphoning off the Great Lakes.
So there's a ton of work being done in the Great Lakes, some really great work in order to prevent that. I mean, there's a number of international treaties in place that protect those waters, and a number of basin commission, or a basin commission, a lot of organizations that are active in that to prevent that. So it's understood to be a shared resource. From my understanding, there is no siphoning off of water from the United States from Canada. I mean, we do have an issue with water transfers within our state, and we have a significant, we want to deal with water by bringing it long distances and looking to alternative sources, but from my knowledge, we don't have any system in place that's taking water from Canada and bringing it here. Yes?
To the best of your knowledge, do you know if developing economies or developed economies consume more water?
Developed economies. I mean, we have the infrastructure to just suck water out. It's amazing. I mean, it takes that. I mean, it takes drills and drinking water facilities and the amount of energy. I mean, there's pumps that take water from surface water and bring it up into the system and treat it, and then it trickles down through gravity. But yes, it's developed countries for sure.
But developing nations like China, Brazil, they don't, like, how do they stack up with the United States?
Interesting. They're probably just as bad. And the biggest issue is that China has heavily polluted its water. But they've taken some real steps to change that. They're issuing executive decrees to change that and to build. Recently they talked about building some kind of executive committee or group to reduce the amount of water pollution in their nation. So there are countries taking active steps in reducing their effect on waters. Yes?
I know that in countries like Ghana and other countries around the world, privatization of water is occurring. Is that something that's inevitable? That will be happening more often?
I hope not. And no, it shouldn't. It really is country specific. So in the United States, there is no privatization of water. Now, we have looked at public-private water partnerships in order to build and finance better infrastructure. But we don't have those kinds of privatization. It's generally understood in the United States that water is part of the public trust, and that the states and government have responsibility to protect those water resources. I can't speak specifically to Ghana, but there are a lot of countries that are facing that there are private countries, and the problem is the lack of law. There's no law preventing that privatization, and that's really what's at stake, is that developing countries really lack the legal infrastructure as much as they lack the physical infrastructure to deal with these challenges. And so a lot of these developing countries are going to have to face, at the same time as their water infrastructure is building and they start to take out more water and they match the amount of water that we're using, that developed countries are using, they're going to have to build that legal infrastructure to protect from that, to make sure that water stays something that is owned by the state itself, or the nation state, or the country, and therefore by the people.
Hi, you just mentioned that not a private ownership of water in the U.S., but we do, right? You can, in the West especially, people own water rights. They granted them 150 years ago. There was a big story in the Atlantic last month about a man who basically is a hedge fund to buy up water rights out west. How does that, and you didn't really mention that, just the way that water rights are distributed particularly in the West. How does that fit into what you were talking about? Because that's not, governments don't own those. It's seen as a private good.
Right. So what's interesting is actually the water is owned by the state. And what you have in a prior appropriation system is that first in time, first in right. So whoever gets the water first has the right to it, but they have a right to use. They don't actually have a right to own. And it's a very, let's say, a thin line of distinction. So I'll grant you that, because I can hint that in your question. And I struggle with it too. That's one of the biggest issues that we have, is that you're right, there are rights that were perfected in the prior appropriation system 150 years ago. And there's not a lot that we can do about it.
Put that in layman's terms for
Sure.
us? Yeah.
So about 150 years ago, actually during the gold rush, people went out to the West, and in order to get access to that gold, they needed water. And so the first person to capture amount of water got the right to use that amount of water. And when we say perfecting a right, is that they put that right to a beneficial use. They put that, and back then it was a more general understanding, and mining was very important. We were in the middle of a gold rush. But today that understanding is a bit more complex. So there's economic considerations that go into place. There's social thoughts that go into place. But it's that you have a right to use the water. You don't have a right to own.
But in practice, they amount to the same thing, right? In practice.
No, because they can be taken back. They can be bought. So through condemnation, you can get access to those rights. And we have, because of the takings clause, you have an ability to, if the government needed to take that back, they could buy it, but they'd have to give just compensation. But it's a right to use, and the idea is that if it's only a right to use, is that you have to put that to a beneficial use. So you can't just use all of the water. Even if you appropriated and perfected a right of a certain extent, it's still, that understanding of use is still, it fluctuates. So you have a right to use an amount of water, but that context is changing. And I think we'll see, as more droughts come into existence, a change in what we see as beneficial use, and in balancing the variety of factors that we have in the law right now. But you're right, it's a very thin line. So it's tough. I mean, it's the thin line. Yes.
You mentioned, you alluded to the need for federal action and that we should move beyond partisan politics on this issue. That there should be some bipartisan agreement. What do you think is the most, or a few of the most important areas where federal policy needs to respond in ways that it's not?
So we need a national water policy. I mean, the European Union issued the Water Framework Directive, and if you generally compare the European Union system to our federal system, they set out, this is what we are trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve efficient use, sustainable water use. They set out policies, they identified objectives that have to be achieved in developing river basin management plans. They said that every state, regardless of your interpolitical boundaries, had to work together as a river basin to build plans, to manage your water. And that's what we need to see in the United States, some direction from the federal government to say, here's a policy, here's how we think about water, this is what you need to do. This is the kinds of policies that you need to put in place. So whatever those policies are, it's to say, first of all, we have to understand that water runs according to a river basin. And right now, our state boundaries decide how our water is allocated. And like I said, we have interstate water compacts that you don't have to create. And there has to be push from the federal government in large part by Congress just doing it for them. So if Congress stepped in and said, you know what, ACF Basin, we're writing your water plan, you'd see a significant change in their behavior because no one wants Congress to write their plan for them. And so that's the kind of direction we need to see from them, something that says this is what you need to be doing, and a priority, a sense of priority from them, just to say this is a real issue that you have to be dealing, you have to face. The White House recently held a water summit. That's a first step. It's a first step. It didn't receive a lot of news given the other events going on that day, but it's a first step in the right direction. But we need leadership. We need leadership from our elected leaders to say this is a national priority. This isn't about politics, but this is how we do it, and everybody's going to benefit from it.
It sounds like the EU is sort of ahead of the U.S. and helping to coordinate across boundaries in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing that they pulled this Water Framework Directive together, which then mandated that if you had within your state, so Spain, for instance, has 17 different autonomous communities, and if the rivers ran between them, you had to create a river basin management plan and a river basin commission that dealt with that river basin holistically. You could not divide up these large river basins into little intra-community basins just to not deal with the regional community next to you. And it was tough. I mean, Spain has actually was very forward-thinking. I mean, they wrote the first water law that was on the books in Europe. But they were still trying to divide how they manage water according to their political boundaries. And so this required them to fix that. And the European Court actually nailed them in one instance for the Basque region, and saying, you can't divide up this little section. It's actually part of a broader river basin, and you have to create that river basin according to that plan. One of the strongest things Spain has done is actually had a long-standing relationship with Portugal through the Albufeira Convention. They have an international treaty, and I'd almost make the argument that they deal better with Portugal than some of their own inter-regional areas. But it's amazing because this Water Framework Directive requires that. If you have international basins that cross international borders, you have to have a river basin management plan that's agreed to by both states. And that's what we need here. We need something similar to say, doesn't matter if you like it or not, or if you're Texas and you don't like Oklahoma, you need to write, and they do actually, but they have the Red River Compact, but you need to write these interstate water compacts. Yes?
Could you go back to the slide that shows the amount going into irrigation?
Sure.
And so my question just is, I'm thinking about, is there leverage there? Because I saw, I don't know if you caught it, the New York Times, maybe other people did show how much water was embodied in one almond and one avocado.
It did, yeah.
About? And it was a phenomenal amount. And I'm just wondering, could we use social media to do that? So my question is, how much could if we leverage consumer demand down, thinking about the water footprint or carbon footprint associated with transportation from California, can we make a big dent, or is that not much of a, consumer demand's not really an issue here?
I don't know about consumer demand. I think it's just educating the consumer. I mean, think about how amazed you were in reading that. The fact that amount of water went into making one almond or one avocado. I mean, that's what we need. We need people that understand those issues. I mean, even I hadn't thought about these individual, how much water goes into each individual thing, but you're amazed. And then you have to question the fact, well, should I buy that avocado? Am I supporting a practice that puts at risk a state, but by the same token, that provides a job to a farmer? And something that I was talking about in the class is that you have these really tough balancing questions that you have to have and think about. And the law doesn't help in that. I mean, it provides, as we talked about, it provides 7 to 15 different factors you have to think about in providing a beneficial use or a reasonable use of water, but no sense of priority or preference, unless the state legislature said, we make a preference for domestic water use, we make this. But yeah, if we labeled our food, if we said, this is how much water went into making your product, I mean, think about that. Think about when we had GMO labeling. I mean, we've had people go, oh my God, what is a GMO? You know, people step back and look at this stuff and they research it, and now we have a whole lobbying body for getting rid of GMOs. And a non-GMO verified project and a label that's created after that. And we could do something very similar in agriculture and water. And it would help push the farmers as well. But I mean, if you also, you know, something that we've talked about is having a sense of cooperation between these farmers. You know, it's a very cutthroat field, and in large part, you know, they need to talk. They need to have a sense of, okay, well, if you're going to grow this crop, maybe I can grow this crop, and a sharing of the economic benefits as well as the water. And planning. I mean, you need a plan. If people sat down and talked about the crops that they were growing, I think you'd see different results. If you got these people to sit down and actually said, okay, Northern California, Southern California, we're going to handle these issues in this way. I mean, I don't know, everybody could storm out, but I really do think if there were people interested in having that vibrant conversation, you get change. You get farmers thinking about that. And the consumers can absolutely be part of that. Yes.
You had a quote at the end that talked about consumer as enforcer.
Yes.
And can you talk a little bit about how that works, or might work at a local level? In my personal experience, when you raise these issues locally, the usual response is, that's not important, this is not pollution, we have bigger things to deal with, like fracking. You know, things that rise to the level of Flint of fracking get people's attention and get the attention of agency offices. So things that are happening local level and more distributed, which in total may add up to something significant, just seem to fall below everyone's radar. What can we as consumers do to not let that happen?
Some of it's time. I mean, think about fracking. When these issues first came out, no one was talking about it. Climate change, same idea. I mean, some of these issues, GMOs, some of these issues take a little bit of time. If it's not time, it's more people. I mean, educating. It's our responsibility. I mean, a large part of what our center does is make these issues accessible. You have to know what your rights are. I mean, the whole point of law is to create a right and an obligation. And so, luckily, one of those families in Flint knew that their water quality should have been of a certain level and brought it to the attention of somebody. And that was huge. I mean, that's exactly what needs to be done. But they needed to get other people that brought it forward. And then you needed to have local representatives that move that forward. I mean, in large part, we vote with the way that we think, and we vote priorities. We need our elected officials talking about these issues. And that's one of the best things that we can do is elect people that are going to think about these issues, that are talking about water.
Can you talk more about the public notification requirement that's in that code as well?
Sure, so under the Safe Drinking Water Act, when it is discovered that you have a violation of the water quality, of the maximum contaminant level, so the maximum amount of pollution that can be in that water, you have to notify the public. And it has to be immediate, and that didn't happen here. So in terms of holding people accountable, you know, it was late. It was very much late. There was a lot of resistance from Michigan in publishing this. And as we all know, or many will know, that there was a report issued by EPA that was kind of put into obscurity. And then it was released. And we saw that, you know, EPA had known about these issues. But in large part, this public notification requirement is one of the best ways of protecting the consumer. And rather than making it a stamp of, well, you violated the law, it should be thought of as, we exist to protect you. Things happen. You know, there are events that happen. You know, we make a mistake. Even if they had just admitted, hey, we made a mistake by not adding this corrosive agent into the water and just fessed up to it and issued this notification, we would have been a lot better off. But there's always this instance and thought about law as just a source of punishment rather than a source of a lot of thought went into this, and we recognize that you have to know. The government, once it finds out, should notify people to protect their health. I mean, we have children that have now been exposed, and we're going to have to deal with those consequences. And that could have been prevented if people just notified. But that first family that came forward and did those tests, I mean, that's amazing. That's what we need. We need consumers that know their rights and act on them. And that's why it's so important to know the law, and that's what we do, is try to make these laws accessible, try to make these issues accessible. And it's not easy. I mean, you know, some of these issues are not particularly interesting, at least to everybody. But it's important, it affects your life. So, yes.
Could you add some aspects about the thermoelectric plants? Are you including, is the reference mainly nuclear power plants, or also cogeneration plants, or different ones? And also, what's the current average that the nuclear plants are using as far as water withdrawal? And also, if you have any concept about what percentage is maybe used for cooling towers and functions versus the other needs for water usage in the nuclear plants?
They are all absolutely great questions. I do not have those stats with me. I'd be happy to find them, though. I mean, they're definitely available. In large part, you know, I mean, there are a lot of stats available in terms of, and actually, you might know some of these numbers.
Coal's the big one.
Yeah.
Coal
Coal-fired.
dwarfs nuclear power in water consumption.
Yeah, especially in the U.S. I don't think we have a lot of nuclear power plants. There's more in Europe, actually. So I think there's quite a few more in Europe than we have here in the United States. So most of it is coal-fired power plants. And that's why there's such a focus on coal-fired power plants, because that's pretty much all we have. And they generate so much greenhouse gases and use so much water.
Okay.
In the United States, we have the Corps of Engineer that deals with water, too much water, flooding in flood reservoirs. We have the USDA that focuses on irrigation and water use that. We have the USGS that looks at water supply, both ground and surface water. We have the EPA that worries about water quality. We have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that works on conservation issues. You don't have a goodwill to help them cooperate. What's going to be the driver? Is it going to be the cost of water? Is it going to? I don't want to have to wait till it gets that bad. But your point about the fact is that we don't put a value on our water here in the U.S.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that? What did Europe change that they got together a national water? I love that idea that you proposed. We need a national water plan. That's both water quality and water quantity. NOAA deals also with climate change.
Yeah.
And what storms and stuff. We lead the world as far as the study of this, and we're terrible as far as good stewardship of our water resources. Why is that? Is it the lack of cooperation?
I think in large part, but I also think in large part that we're dealing with so many issues. I mean, if you look at the United States, it's huge. And we have 50 different states with 50 different legal,
That's a part of it.
and that's it. I mean, the way in which, if you look at the development, and I talked about this in the class earlier, if you look at the way in which these allocation schemes developed, it's nuts. I mean, it's fascinating, but it's absolutely nuts. And we need people working together. We need to actually sit down and say, okay, I get it. You have a right that, you know, you perfected 150 years ago. That's fantastic. I think we're going to have to change that. We're going to have a real conversation about where this water is going and how we're using it. And you should be a part of that because, you know, look at the drought. All those junior right holders, that's not a right. They couldn't use the water. There was no water to use. So is that really a right? Is that really a problem? I mean, it was meaningless. And one of the things I talked about today is that we've allocated water in the wettest of seasons. So through prior appropriation, we allocate water through the wettest season. So that when you have drought, I mean, a third of your permit holders have no access to water. So we either generate other water resources or we have emergency measures put into place, which actually, funny enough, reduced the amount of water use by 25%. And then when there was rain, people were talking about getting rid of those emergency measures. I mean, we really don't learn. And the well goes dry and we still learn nothing. We still have a drought in California and we're like, oh, let's get rid of these emergency measures now. That's crazy. We have wealthy communities in California who are like, I'm above the law. I'm just going to pay the fine because I can. I think it was $1,000 a day. There was an article about it. And I won't name names, but an actor in a very well-respected show was part of that. I mean, they think, and that's the problem. If you can pay that fine, then you're fine. I mean, there are companies, and I think less so, or I would like to believe less so, that they gamble in terms of they'll pollute to make their profits, but they know that the actual enforcement action is going to take 15 to 20 years to resolve itself. So they have 15 to 20 years to do what they want to do, pay the fine later on, and go on. Now, that's really relegated to the larger of industries because they have that kind of money. The smaller ones, not so much. But I mean, it's going to take a real shift, and we just don't have the political will at that point. I mean, all the things that I talked about, to get somebody to sit down and talk about energy, food, water, recreation, navigation, manufacturing, industry, all in the same conversation, I mean, good luck. I mean, you can't even get somebody in the room to talk about the water energy nexus or the water climate change nexus.
Is it possible to use some of the states or local municipalities to try to build, maybe use them as pilot programs to see if there is a way to bring these different components together and then have much, maybe then try at the national level?
So my colleague gives a leading question. I absolutely love the idea of having localities and municipalities. I think that for so long we've said that the power's in the locality. It is. I mean, the local systems and the municipalities can come together. They're smaller political bodies. And they can gather that will. I mean, there's a different kind of conversation that happens at the state level than happens at the national level. And it's certainly more constructive sometimes, depending on the state. But for the most part, we could get that conversation happening. I mean, you even saw it in California. You did see those conversations. I mean, I have to give credit where credit's due. You do see those conversations happening, and you do see farmers making an effort. I mean, sometimes the media painted them out as just haphazardly using water when they will, but there is interest. I mean, there are people that are trying. But there's a huge opportunity to look into use these local governance bodies and municipalities to say, okay, we have this area of water. We're going to build a water management plan. We're going to sit down and talk about what it means to protect our water. What does it mean to safeguard our water, to make sure that we can have water for today and have water for tomorrow?
It starts to sound a little bit like what you're talking about right now is a solution that's not like what states have done in dealing with climate change or pollution. As the federal government has been gridlocked over the last 15 years, we've seen states begin to move on. So California imposed much higher emission standards, and then a bunch of other states decided that was a good idea, we should follow along with this. And so what what in the 70s Nixon might have done to a top-down sort of thing has turned into more on the pollution side, more of a ground up.
Yeah.
So I hear, at first I heard you earlier talking about the barriers of federalism, but then it also sounds like working within federalism in the way that environmental stuff has might be part of the solution.
No, and it could work. I mean, and ironically, California has been a driver of that, and we're not seeing them drive this policy here. And that's what I'm not really sure what the issue. I mean, Michigan could be the next driver. But even them, I mean, we're embattled right now in a finger-pointing game. Who did what, and why did they not do this, and who's at fault? Yes, somebody needs to be held accountable, and the beauty of the law is that it does hold that person accountable because they made negligent and grossly negligent decisions, I think could be argued, whoever they are. But Michigan could drive that conversation to say, let's take a look at that Safe Drinking Water Act, let's see what needs to be fixed. How did the law allow this to happen? And so the states can, through these kinds of incidences, or even if they're not, I mean, even local areas in California could say, look, we want to change. We're gonna generate the change from here and then hope that the state adopts something bigger. And even wealthy communities. I mean, wealthy communities can drive that conversation because they have more money, and they should. Any other questions? Yes.
From your international perspective, I mean, sometimes countries come out of nowhere to really be a lead on these types of issues. So either from intergovernmental cooperation or collaboration or incredible efficiencies, what are some of the best case studies from around the world that might have surprised you in your research?
It was actually interesting. We were talking about if I was to provide an example of the best water law that existed, I actually cannot name one. I mean, Australia, if you looked at Australia, they were a driving area in this. I mean, in their Murray-Darling Basin was the beautiful interstate, intra-country policy that governed these basins. A drought hits, everybody goes to their separate corners and they use the water that they want to use. And there's an ultimate failure of that institution, even though it had been working beautifully. I mean, you had brought everybody together and it was kumbaya. And then you get the drought that hits and nothing, everyone goes to their separate corners. And that's the problem. We have to have institutions that can withstand the toughest of times. I mean, Spain, I think, provides a great example. They're a country that's dealt with significant water shortages, and they don't have all the right answers, but they're sitting back and they're looking at, they don't even have a clear understanding of, it's the local municipalities that create the tariffs to pay for water. And so in one of the river basins, I was sitting there and asking, okay, so how are you going to make sure that you're recuperating the costs that you put out to provide these water services? Well, we have to start by figuring out what are these little localities charged to begin with? And what we're finding is that some localities actually charge nothing for water, and they just go into debt providing these services. Other localities are charging a ton of money for those services. And so that's, and they've recognized this as an issue. They're building the data and they're going to go forward from that. They're building a management plan that actually allows for that recuperation, that requires those municipalities to gain some kind of equality between those rates, so that one locality isn't bearing the burden versus another. And I think that's a working body. That's an example of a working body, that the local river basin or the river basin commission comes together and says, we have a problem, let's do the research, gets the research and addresses it and finds a solution. And I was impressed with what Spain is doing. And I think, they certainly have a great example. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.